I would like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which these interviews take place. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge the Wangal people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. Hi, I'm Prema, the host of this podcast, What Can We Do? I started this podcast in 2019 because I was feeling overwhelmed and anxious about issues affecting communities. There's so much going on in this world, so much to address, so much to fix. Where's the best place to start? Here. In each episode, I speak to someone or an organization that's making impact. You will learn about the issue, why it exists, the challenges, but most importantly, how you can be a part of the solution. My hope is that you can take away 2 to 3 tips each episode that will support you in your helping journey. Today I have with me Charishma Kaliyanda, who is a Liverpool City Councillor.
Thank you so much, Prema, for having me.
Could you tell us what being a City Councillor is all about?
There are two parts to local government usually. One is the part of council that most people would probably be familiar with and would be dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and that's the operational side of council. And so the operational side deals with everything from hiring of venues through to collection of rubbish and construction of roads and all of those really vital things on a day-to-day basis. There's also an elected arm of local government. Depending on the size of the council, it will have a different size of its elected arm. But in Liverpool, there are 10 councillors that are elected every 4 years and one mayor. So since the mid-90s, our mayor has been popularly elected, which basically means that our residents vote for who they believe should be their mayor. And the elected arm of council has a main role to play in terms of setting a vision for what an area should be like, having a strategy for various aspects of the local area, the sort of overall framework that the operational side of council implements on a day-to-day basis.
What is your average day like?
It's very hard to answer that question because there are no 2 days which are the same. Most councillors have a day job or may have something else that they do. So personally, I work 4 days a week as an occupational therapist in the youth mental health space. I kind of allocate 1 day a week to sort of council projects or community related activities. Far and large, my the usual things that I do as a councillor is basically act as the bridge between residents in the community and what happens with council. It could be anything from responding to emails about requiring replacements for garbage bins or potholes on the roads or even accepting a petition.
How did you start your journey to becoming a councillor?
So I first started thinking about what representation looks like when I was at university. My first year, our university was making some really significant changes to the length of our academic semester, the types of courses we had available. I was sitting in a tutorial one day complaining about the fact that most of the courses that I wanted to do the next semester were being cut and were no longer being offered. And one of my classmates said, I understand, I agree with you, but what are you going to do about it? And that was a very powerful question and one that's really stuck with me. And she invited me to be part of their group that was running to be part of the University Student Representative Council that year. And that's when I sort of really started, my journey into sort of representation and understanding what representing your community looks like. Through the people that I met on that journey and at university, I then got involved in a political party and really sort of saw the value of representation in a local sense. I took a lot of pride in attending branch meetings, in being very active and involved locally. So if there were things that I saw that, my friends or family friends or, my family members had raised, I would take them along to branch meetings and say, oh, hey, have you thought about this? And after a few years, my local member of parliament basically had a chat with me and said, there's this opportunity to run on the council ticket that's coming up. And the first time I ran, I was actually unsuccessful, but I felt it was a really useful and educational experience. And so I learned a lot, and that's kind of how I started.
Could you describe the demographic of Liverpool City for those who may not be familiar?
So Liverpool is one of the most multicultural cities in Australia, I would say. We have a huge number of our over 60% of our population either has at least one parent born overseas. Our residents speak over 140 different languages, so it's very much a multicultural hub. So Liverpool, interestingly enough, is the fourth oldest colonial settlement after Sydney, Parramatta, Hobart. And we also have a very rich and diverse Indigenous history as well. And Liverpool is where the lands of three different First Nations peoples meets. And so it has always, for a long time been regarded as a bit of a meeting place. And that's why that's something that I like to think is reflected in our current population as well.
During the first time when you contested, what was the candidate field like? Was it diverse?
I would say that there was. Our population is incredibly diverse. However, what really struck me was when I was elected in 2016, I found out that I was the 11th woman elected to Liverpool Council in our 140-year history.
Wow.
So we have had a number of candidates over the years when it comes to people from different cultural backgrounds, people from different genders, different age groups, all of those sorts of things. However, when it comes to actually being elected to council, we actually haven't had a lot of diversity. Our mayor, who is the first woman to hold that position, was elected for the first time in 2008. And she's currently serving her second term as mayor.
Whatever you just shared, that's not specific just to Liverpool City. That's actually happening at different levels of government, isn't that right?
When it comes to the number of, say, women who have been elected to local government, the numbers in New South Wales are quite poor. So in this current term, there's less than 1/3 of councillors who are women. But I also remember there being 5 local government areas in New South Wales where there are no women who hold elected positions. And there's not a lot of statistics, or there's not a lot of data collection that has been done in looking at how many people of colour hold elected positions in any level of government. And so that's definitely something that we probably need to have more movement on, similar to what is happening in other Western multicultural nations.
Yeah. When I saw you speak in the Politics in Colour forum, along with other councillors, there was a opinion that was shared that many agreed with, that when a woman of colour enters politics, there are a few barriers to cross. First is, of course, the gender barrier, and then there's also a cultural barrier. What was that experience like for you?
There was almost sort of like a triple whammy factor. So not only was I a woman, but I was also obviously from a different cultural background, but I was also quite young when I first ran and then was subsequently elected to council. And so coming from a culture where there is definitely a deference to elders. Young people are very much meant to listen rather than speak and advocate. There was definitely an expectation that of the types of behaviours, of the types of approaches you would take when it comes to representation. it's not limited to just the culture that I come from. I know that very often the broader social expectation is for women to be very much in the background. It's not just limited to politics. You see examples of this in business, in not-for-profit organizations, and in reflection. I also had to do a lot of work in challenging myself about what what am I limiting myself from? Because I think these are the types of behaviors that are expected of me more broadly. How would I be approaching this as me? So what am I holding back from because I don't think I should be that outspoken, or because I don't think I should be doing these things, rather than what is authentically the way that I would approach this.
What was the community's response to you when you were on the ground, getting to know them and introducing yourself?
I think it made a huge difference that I've lived in community for, almost 30 odd years. So the support from um, my community, from the people that I knew and who knew me, was absolutely fantastic. It was actually a real confidence booster, because when people who have known you for a while are actually really supportive and encouraging, it just gives you that sense of, oh, okay, maybe I'm doing the right thing. The response from people I didn't know was actually heartening as well.
What do you love most about your role?
I'm naturally a very curious person, right? I love learning new things about people, about communities, about the world around me. Probably the thing that I love the most about my role on council is that every day brings something new, and every day I learn a little bit more about my community, and that keeps things interesting.
What are some of the challenges you face in this role?
The one that I would identify just top of the list is lack of time. So um, there's always a conflict between the various things that you might need to do, some, like, invitations you might get to attend community functions and things like that. So sometimes I wish I could clone myself to help make that process a little bit easier. Something that I've kind of taken a while to come to terms with is that there's no set pathway, or there's no set formula in terms of how to do this role effectively, and it can be a real challenge to sort of to think that you have to do XYZ right from the get-go, whereas people who have been in these roles already have a shorthand of how to do it. My first term was very much about figuring out what works best for me and how I can work and be most effective. Unlearning some of those typical ways of doing things, I think, has been really important, and quite a challenge. There was not really anyone who I thought had similar life experiences, or there wasn't really any sort of template or roadmap or whatever. So trying to fumble my way through has been a bit of a challenge in that sense.
Speaking of finding your way through all of this and it being your first term, you've also been thrown an additional challenge, which has been the recent, 3 to 4 month lockdown that disproportionately affected Southwest Sydney. What was that like for you?
It was a big learning curve for myself, just as it was for I think most people within our community. The biggest learning point for me, right, was just the sheer gap between governments and how governments work and think that communities work, and the reality of how communities and people actually work. And I think there's a lot of room there for change, and I hope that that's something that we can do as a community, in terms of changing our government and changing the way that our governments do things in the next sort of 6 to 12 months, because I think the pandemic has really laid bare some of the existing challenges and some of the existing cracks in both our health and economic systems. A lot of those factors were what was underlying the impact of the pandemic locally. The other thing that was, I think, really important to highlight is that there was such a big difference between the public representation of what Southwest Sydney was like and the community, the communities that make up Southwest Sydney versus how our communities see themselves, how we actually function in reality. And I have lost count of the number of people that have said to me, the way that we're being represented in the media, the way that we feel people kind of are blaming us for the situation that broader Sydney is unfair, and we feel voiceless in this situation. And my heart broke when I heard that, because growing up in Southwest Sydney, there are definitely sort of stereotypes around everything from what your life is like to the physical environment that you grow up in, to the types of careers that you can aspire to, and those sorts of things. So those prejudices, those stereotypes are definitely still there. But I feel like for the residents of Southwest Sydney, they actually found that they are so much more powerful than people, the broader sort of media commentary or broader political commentary gave them credit for. One thing that didn't get covered was how much volunteering there was, and the fact that a lot of the people who couldn't access support through mainstream functions were actually getting it from not-for-profit organisations or their neighbours or their friends, and people were stepping in to provide help where the government couldn't.
You said the government operates in a certain way that is quite different from how the community actually operates. Is this a lack of consultation, a lack of lived experience?
A little bit of both. So on the one hand, where you have institutions which are set up in particular ways, and they have historically worked with particular processes and that sort of thing, change is hard, right? And in parts of Southwest and Western Sydney, we have a lot of newer communities. We have a lot of migrant communities who don't really function the way that the government is set up to function, or the government predicts they are set up to function, right? When you have this real sort of like gap between sort of like the formula and the reality of what's being input into that formula, but then you have a limited capacity for flexibility and for change, you create a situation where that gap exists. Like I said before, it has laid bare problems that have been sort of building for several decades. Part of the reason why the transmission rates were so high was because 70 to 80% of our population work in essential services. People weren't able to work from home, but also, families were larger. They happened to unfortunately contract the virus. If they brought it home, the Delta variant meant that the likelihood of all of their household contracting it was almost 100%. And rather than addressing some of those factors and kind of going, okay, well, if we truly need people to stay at home, and if we're truly looking at household contagion rather than community contagion, how can we tailor our message to do that? That wasn't done until weeks into the pandemic.
What you've just shared, I feel that really highlights the importance of having elected representatives who are from the community or have the lived experience.
Yeah, definitely. There's a real kind of drive for local representation, because regardless of any other factor, if someone that is supposed to be representing you and speaking for you as your representative, if they have experiences that mirror yours, if they're local and if they kind of understand the kind of the building blocks of the community that we all live within, then they're able to make better decisions. They're able to advocate for you more effectively, and they're able to, in as much as they can, minimize that gap between how governments expect communities to work and how they actually work.
What traits do you think someone needs to have to fulfill the role of an elected representative?
What I would say has been very effective and helpful for me is firstly, taking that open-minded approach. So it's really important that I constantly kind of question myself and say, am I resistant to this because I am, being blinkered? Or am I resistant to this because what someone is telling me is genuinely not good information, or it's a genuinely kind of different perspective to where I'm coming from? So being able to just really kind of constantly question myself and why I'm responding the way that I am to certain things is really important. The other thing that I would say, and it's taken me a long time to sort of develop this, is being comfortable with disagreement. When you have a responsibility as a decision maker, not everyone is going to agree with the decisions that you make. And so you have to be comfortable with the decisions that you make and why you have made them. If you can justify them to yourself, if you can say, on the basis of the information that I had, on the basis of the preparation that I did, this is the decision that I would make. And yes, hindsight might tell me something different, but you can only make the decisions that you do with the information and the resources that you have at the time.
If you wanted people to take away one thing from this interview, what would that be?
Oh, that's really tough. I would say that if you are listening to this podcast, the likelihood that you have had the thought of, I want to put my hand up for a representative position, or I want to be involved in some form of activism, is quite high. And if you have had that thought, then the chances that you are going to be good at it are also quite high. So maybe this is your sign to act on that thought, to act on that kind of underlying desire, and start that process of talking to people, of figuring out what getting involved looks like for you. If this conversation and this involvement is your sign, please go ahead and start, because starting can be the hardest part, but from there, once you start that process, it gets easier.
So what lies ahead for you?
So for the moment, I am focused obviously on the council elections coming up in December. And then I am very much looking forward to taking a little bit of a break, because the year has been quite hectic. But next year, I am really looking forward to sort of implementing a whole range of different ideas that I have, both on the council front, but also on in terms of my work with my work for my day job. And so something that I'm really kind of excited about is looking at how to encourage women, particularly women of colour, in my local area, to understand what getting involved on council or getting involved with local community organisations looks like, and how they can, and potentially establishing pathways in Liverpool to go ahead and do that, and also looking at kind of some of the bigger picture initiatives to get more people of colour involved in politics overall.
And how can people follow your work? Are you active on socials?
Yes, absolutely. So I am active on Facebook, on Instagram, as well as LinkedIn. So please feel free to connect with me and have a chat. Yeah, more than happy to have discussions with people.
Thank you so much, Charishma. Personally, for me, I found this chat very helpful, because I have considered time and time again how and when I should get involved in grassroots or community level work, or even at the council level. So I definitely have taken away quite a bit from this interview. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow it on social media. Your support will help this podcast reach more listeners. You can also check out the podcast and transcripts on whatcanwedopodcast.com. This podcast is produced by Samuham Media.